Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so just like I told you guys in class, during this kind of forced school closure situation that we all find ourselves in, we're going to try and just keep going in class, or excuse me, at home, as we would in class, and we're going to try and just keep pace with what we would be doing in class. So each day I'm going to try and post a video screencast for you. It's going to take the place of a lesson we would have done in class, and by doing this, we're going to be able to keep on pace and kind of prepare you guys for the AP exam. So I want you guys to treat it just like you would in class. Copy the aim down, copy down the points, try and take good solid notes throughout. So we're just going to kind of continue with the 1920s here. We were talking about the social dynamics of the 1920s in class when we left on Friday, and immigration and nativism that's growing, and social tensions around prohibition and women kind of like expanding their role and like challenging some gender norms. So what we're going to talk about today a little bit is the economy of the 20s and some things that are kind of expanding. So one of the big things that's going on in the 1920s economically is industrial growth is happening. And what I want you guys to think about, a good time period to compare the 20s to is the Gilded Age. What is similar about it? What is different about it? Another good time period to compare it to is the 1950s, but we're really not up to that yet. So like that would be something that you have to do later when we learn about the 50s. So one of the things I want you guys to think about is what's similar about the 20s to the Gilded Age, what's different about the 20s compared to the Gilded Age. So when you look at industrial growth, one of the phrases that they use to kind of describe the 20s is the Roaring 20s. Now you have to think about what does that mean, and when they say the Roaring 20s, they're really talking about economic growth. And the country is expanding economically. The stock market is expanding. There's growth in the overall GDP of the country. Now, it doesn't mean that every single industry is expanding and growing. Certain ones are doing much better than others. So when you look at some of the industries that are doing well and are growing, you have number one, the automobile industry is doing fantastic, and a lot of industries related to automobiles are doing well. So like the rubber industry is doing well, the steel industry is doing well to a certain extent. You have the glass industry related to automobiles is doing well. Now you also have some other industries that are doing well as also flourishing. So you have the radio industry, which is a new form of technology in the time period that's doing very well. So those are some of the industries that are really kind of expanding and what we would call roaring during the 1920s and doing better. Some ones that are not doing that well and are kind of like sick industries of the 20s, you have the railroad industry, you have the coal industry, and you have agriculture is kind of struggling. Now, when you compare those two different lists that we gave you, industries that were struggling and industries that are doing well, the industries that are struggling are more of like your traditional industries that were doing really well in like the turn of the century, 1900s kind of America, and like fueled that Gilded Age industrial growth. Now they're kind of declining and you have new industries kind of taking their place. Now, a lot of these new industries are more what we would consider to be consumer-driven industries, that a lot of them are more luxury type industries than some of your more traditional based industries that were growing in the Gilded Age. So that's kind of an interesting comparison, and that's going to mean a lot kind of going forward when we talk about the stock market crash that ends the 1920s and what that means for America's industrial growth. So during the 20s, we're kind of going through a boom period. So there's boom and kind of bust periods or depressions and kind of peaks in our capitalist system. And the 20s is definitely kind of like a boom cycle that we're kind of experiencing as an economic situation. Now, one of the big innovations, and a lot of the innovations of the 20s, comes in the automobile industry. So what you're looking at here is actually a picture from one of Henry Ford's automobile plants. Now, we've talked about this whole idea of the assembly line before, and this whole idea of tailorization, right? Like splitting up and compartmentalizing the work, and each person does a different task on the assembly line. Now, you should notice here in this picture, what's different about Ford's approach to tailorization is that Ford adds in mechanization to his assembly line. So that's the key. It's that it's on a conveyor belt, essentially, so it's moving. And so like basically why that's a big change and a big innovation is that it paces your work even further than just putting it on assembly line, because a conveyor belt is going to move, whatever it might be, every couple of minutes or every couple of hours, whatever it is, and they kind of pace those cars moving down the assembly line. And what that does is it forces you to work at a certain speed, and essentially that creates more efficiency within the factory. So Ford is huge on like efficiency. So they even kind of name another term after him. They call like this whole idea of Fordism. It's kind of like taking Taylorization and then essentially perfecting it. So it adds mechanization to it. And then it kind of adds like even more efficiency to like a factory system. Ford even tried to regulate how you talked on the assembly line, so they called it the Ford whisper, and they would try to whisper to each other to try and increase efficiency on the factory floor. Now, Ford, for all of this, he is very innovative and pretty incredible at what he's able to accomplish as a car manufacturer. So we have to talk a little bit about Ford's success as a car manufacturer. So if you look here, this is kind of Ford's projected sales of automobiles over the 1920s, and it really kind of skyrockets towards the end of the 1920s. And Ford really, his goal was to put a car in every American's driveway. He wanted every American to own a car. And so the car becomes a huge part of Americans' lives. And what he wants to do is he wants everybody this automobile to be accessible to everybody. And before this, cars were kind of like a toy for rich people. It was a luxury item. And it's still expensive, a car, but Ford is able to make it much more affordable. He wanted the people who worked in his factory to be able to buy his cars. And so he took a very interesting approach to it. So Ford's approach to this was he was going to kind of simplify the manufacturing process, make it more efficient using Taylorization and expanding it with his own innovations of mechanization of the assembly line. But what he also did was kind of streamline what he made. So the old joke about Fords was you could have a Ford in any color that you wanted as long as it was black. And what they meant by that was there's no personalization to a Ford Model T, which is the name of the car that he made. Basically, it's mass production of a car. And the way that he made it affordable to people was that, there was no personalization or kind of individuality to the car. It was just kind of like a basic good car, and it was made available to the masses of Americans. And so other car companies try different approaches, but Ford is the most successful. Now, we're going to take the car industry because it is the biggest industry of the 20s and kind of look at it as an example of what was going on in a lot of industries in America at the time. So if you notice here, you have Ford, you have GM, you have some other smaller ones like Hudson and Chrysler, some imported car companies as well. Now, there's really only like a handful of car companies that dominate the industry. And so in modern day America, this kind of reminds me a little bit of, let's say, for example, like cell phones. There's really only a few cell phones like T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon that kind of dominate the cell phone industry. Now, that's not really a monopoly because you have multiple companies, but you do have several companies that own a large share of the market or almost the entire market. So what they call this an oligopoly. And what that means, an oligopoly means that it's not one company that dominates the industry, but a few companies, a small few companies kind of dominate the industry. And you see that happening here in the automobile industry. So if you compare that to the trusts and monopolies of the Gilded Age, there are some similarities, there are some differences. They do have competition with each other, but it is very difficult for smaller manufacturers to jump into this competition because these guys are pretty much giants in the industry. Same thing like today with cell phones. It's difficult for a smaller provider to kind of jump in and compete with the T-Mobile or compete with the Verizon. So what you want to think about here is like, should the federal government be stepping in and breaking up oligopolies? Is this okay to have just a few companies dominate an industry? Or do you think no? Because we move now out of the progressive era. The government is going to be much less willing to step in and break up things and kind of like regulate business to the degree that they did during the progressive era. And so they don't really kind of regulate this. They kind of allow this to happen. But you have to think, like, should they be allowing this to happen? Is this a good practice for like the economic makeup of the country for the time? And so like with this comes kind of like a nationalization of a lot of companies. So you see some of our first national chains develop. So Woolworths is not really around anymore, but this is your first like department store. Supermarkets make their first appearance into American life, and even some fast food like White Castle makes its first appearance, and these are nationwide chains. Today we go a step further. Today we have international chains. We have Targets, Walmarts. They're not just in America, but they're across the entire country as well. So that's kind of like the modern expansion of this. Now, the other thing you want to kind of be aware of in the 20s is really what's going on with labor unions. Now, we're looking right here in this part of the graph, and what you should notice is that labor unions kind of rose during the progressive era all the way up. So they start pretty low in the Gilded Age. They rise throughout the progressive era. They kind of hit their peak around like 1920, for, at least in early America. Then they decline, all the way through the 20s, and then come back up later in the 40s and the 50s. So like the 20s is a decline of labor unions. So you have to think about why. Why are labor unions kind of declining in the time period? What does that mean for America? So first off, it means that as far as labor is concerned, they don't have as much power as they had during the progressive era, and definitely not as much power as they have in the 40s and 50s and 60s, which is the height of labor unions within the United States. So really the big reason for a lot of this decline has to do with some practices of companies. So companies like Ford and Ford's Motor Company and some other really big companies, what they were able to do is they kind of created their own like corporate labor unions essentially. So they call them like company labor unions. And so they kind of like took the place of labor unions in certain cases, except they're kind of like sanctioned by the company. And, people like Ford, they were smart. What Ford would do in his company, he really didn't want labor unions, just like you have, the Carnegies and the Vanderbilts that don't want labor unions in the Gilded Age. But he didn't take the approach of trying to like break up strikes and kind of crush labor unions and do blacklisting. What Ford tried to do was make working at a Ford Motor Factory so prosperous that you didn't feel the need to join a labor union. So he would kind of like raise people's salaries, give them good benefits, give them vacations, and essentially it was trying to minimize the impact of labor unions through better treatment of workers. And in a lot of ways it's kind of successful in the 20s. And so like you see that labor unions really do kind of decline throughout the era. Now, one of the things you should kind of notice here is that during the 20s, like you have a big gap. As labor unions go down, you see kind of like the gap between the wealthier people and like the average American kind of growing. And if you look here in the 50s and 60s, when you have high union membership, that gap really lessens a lot. So unions are able to kind of like bring up the middle class in a lot of cases. And so like one of the things you want to note is the 20s has a large gap between the wealthy, the top 10%, and your lower class and even middle class in America. And what kind of coincides with this is two things. One, the average person's purchasing power starts to decline a little bit in the 20s. Even though like things are going pretty good in the 20s as far as like the economy is concerned, not everybody necessarily is able to benefit from it by having the ability to purchase things with like real cash. They're going to use a lot of credit, but not necessarily with real cash. And if you look at what's happening here, like this, I think graph is really telling. This shows you, the red line here shows you the top 1% in America, and this is throughout the 20s. And if you notice, their share is kind of just growing and growing and growing. Everybody else's share, the US average, the farm average, is basically staying flat. So essentially what's happening is that, the average person is not being able to purchase as much as they could later in the decade as they could earlier in the decade. Okay, so we're going to wrap our screencast there for today. Like I said, we're going to try and do a screencast each day, so make sure you check out Edmodo and you kind of stay on top of your assignments.